The Infernal City, an Elder Scrolls Tale by Greg Keyes. Prologue. When Ifetch felt the sea shudder, he knew. The wind had already fallen like a dead thing from the sky, gasping as it succumbed upon the iron swells, breathing its last to his mariner's ears. The sky always knew first. The sea was slow, dreadful slow, to come around. The sea shook again, or rather, seemed to drag beneath their keel up in the crow's nest. Keem screamed as he was tossed out like a kitten. Ifetch watched him twist and almost impossibly catch the rigging with those Cathay right claws of his. Stendar, Grain swore in her South Nibbin twang. What was that? A tsunami? Her feeble human gaze searched out through the dusk. No, Ifetch murmured. I was off the Somerset Isles when the sea tried to swallow them, and I felt one of those pass under us, and another, when I was younger, off the coast of Morrowind. In deep water, you don't feel much. This is deep water. Then what? She brushed her silver and grey bangs off her useless eyes. Ifetch twitched his shoulders in imitation of a human shrug, and ran his claws through the patchy fur of his forearm. The still air smelled sweet like rotten fruit. See anything, Kim? He called up. My own death, nearly, the Nequine alien cat shouted back, his voice raspy hollow, as if the ship was in a box. He lithely hauled his sleek body back into the nest. Nothing on the sea, he continued after a moment. Under it then, Grain said nervously. Ifetch shook his head. The wind, he said. And then he saw it in the south. A sudden blackness, a crackle of green lightning, then a form like a tall thunderhead billowing into being. Hold on, he shouted, and now came a clap like thunder, but 40 times louder, and a new fist of wind that snapped the mainmast, taking poor Keem to the death he had nearly seen. Then all was still again, except for the roaring in his damaged ears. By the gods, what can it be? He barely heard Grain ask. The sea doesn't care, Ifetch said, watching the dark mass move toward them. He looked around his ship. All of the masts were broken, and it appeared that half the crew were already gone. What? Not many Khajiit take to the sea, he said. They'll bear it for trade to move Skooma around, but few there are who love her. But I've adored her since I could mew, and I could love her because she doesn't care what the gods or Daedra think. She's another world with her own rules. What are you going on about? I'm not sure, he admitted. I feel it. I don't think it. But don't you think? Doesn't it feel like... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Grain stared out toward the thing. I see it now, she said. Yes. I saw an Oblivion gate open once, she said, when my father worked in Leowin. I saw things. It feels a little like that. But Martin's sacrifice, they say it can't happen again, and it doesn't look like a gate. It wasn't shaped like a thunderhead, Ifetch realized, more like a fat cone, point down. Another wind was starting up, and on it something unbelievably foul. It doesn't matter what it is, he said, not to us. And a few instants later, it didn't. Saul's throat hurt, so he knew he had been screaming. He was soaked with sweat, his chest ached, and his limbs were trembling. He opened his eyes and forced his head up so he could see where he was. A man stood in the doorway with a drawn sword. His eyes were very wide and blue beneath a shock of curly, barely colored hair. Swearing, Saul reached for his own weapon, where it hung on the bedpost. Just hold on there, the fellow said, backing up. It's just you've been hollering, so I was worried. Something was happening to you. The dream light was still fading, but his mind was starting to turn. If the fellow had wanted him dead, he probably would be. Where am I? He asked. taking a grip on his long sword despite his reasoning. "In the Langfellow Inn," the man replies. Then after a pause, "In Coral." "Coral? Right. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Syl said. "Nothing to concern you." "Ah, yes." The man looked uncomfortable. "Do you, scream like that I won't be here tonight," Syl cut him off. "I'm moving on." "I didn't mean to offend you." "You didn't," Syl replied. "The breakfast is out, down there." "Thank you. Please leave me." The man closed the door. Syl sat there for a moment, rubbing the lines in his forehead. "Azura," he murmured. He always knew the prince's touch, even when it was light. This had not been light. He closed his eyes and tried to feel the sea jump beneath him, to hear the old Khajiit captain's words, see again, through his eyes, that thing appearing in the sky. Everything about it stank of oblivion. After spending 20 years there, he ought to know the smell. "Vahun," he sighed. "It must be you. Vahun, I think. Why else would the prince send me such a vision? What else would matter to me?" No one answered, of course. He remembered a little more after the Khajiit had died. He had seen Ilzeven as he last saw her, pale and lifeless, and the smoking Shatterlands that had once been Morrowind. Those were always there in his dreams, whether Azura meddled with them or not. But there had been another face, a young man, Calovian probably, with a slight bend in his nose. He seemed familiar, as if they had met somewhere. "That's all I get?" Syl asked. "I don't even know what ocean to look in." The question was directed at Azura, but he knew it was rhetorical. He also knew he was lucky to get even that. He dragged his wiry grey body out of the bed and went over to the wash basin to splash water in his face and blink red eyes at himself in the mirror. He started to turn away when he noticed, behind him in the reflection, a couple of books propped in an otherwise empty shelf. He turned, walked over, and lifted the first. "Tales of Southern Waters," it announced. He nodded his head and opened the first. "The Most Current and High Adventures of Prince Atribus," this one read. And there, on the frontispiece, was an engraving of a young man's face with a slightly crooked nose. For the first time in years, Syl uttered a hoarse laugh. "Well, there you go," he said. "I'm sorry I doubted you, my prince." An hour later, armed and armored, he rode south and east, toward madness, retribution, and death. And though he had long ago forgotten what happiness was, he imagined it must have been a little like what he felt now. Part 1. Arrival. A pale young woman with long ebon curls, and a male, muddy green scales and chocolate spines, crouched on the high rafters of a rotting villa in Lilmuth, known by some as the festering jewel of Blackmarsh. "You're finally going to kill me," the reptile told the woman. His tone was thoughtful, his saurian features composed in the faint light bleeding down through the cracked slate roof. "Not so much kill you as get you killed," she answered, pushing the tight rings of her hair off her face and pressing her slightly aquiline nose and grey-green gaze toward the vast open space beneath them. "It works out the same," the other hissed. "Come on, Glim," Aniag said, tossing herself into her father's huge leather chair and clasping her hands behind her neck. "We can't pass this up." "Oh, I think it can be safely said that we can," Mayor Glim replied. He lounged on a low weave cane couch, one hard, draped so as to suspend over a cypress end table, whose surface was supported by the figure of a crouching Khajiit warrior. The Argonian was all silhouette, because behind him the white curtains that draped the massive bay windows of the study were soaked in sunlight. Here are some things we could do instead. He ticked one glossy black claw on the table. Stay here in your father's villa and drink his wine. A second claw came down. Take some of your father's wine down to the docks and drink it there. The third, drink some here and drink some down at the docks. Glyn, how long has it been since we had an adventure? His lazy lizard gaze traveled over her face. If by adventure you mean some tiring or dangerous exercise, not that long. Not long enough anyway. He wiggled the fingers of both hands as if trying to shake something sticky off them. A peculiarly Lilmothian expression of agitation. The membranes between his digits shone translucent green. Have you been reading again? He made it sound like an accusation, as if reading was another way of referring to, say, infanticide. A bit, she admitted. What else am I to do? It's so boring here. Nothing ever happens. Not for lack of you trying, Mirgulum replied. We very nearly got arrested during your last little adventure. Yes, and didn't you feel alive, she said. I don't need to feel alive, the Argonian replied. I am alive. Which state I would prefer to retain. You know what I mean. If it's a bold assertion, he sniffed. I'm a bold girl, she sat forward. Come on, Glim. He's a very crocodile, I'm certain of it. We can get the proof. First of all, Mirgulum said, there's no such thing as a mere crocodile. Secondly, if there were, why on earth should we care to prove it? Because? Well, because people would want to know. We'd be famous. And he's dangerous. People around there are always disappearing. In Puss Bottom, of course they are. It's one of the dodgiest parts of town. Look, she said, we found people bitten in half. What else could do that? A regular crocodile. Lots of things, really, with some effort. I might be able to do it too. He fidgeted again. Look, if you're so sure about this, get your father to talk Underwarden Easton into sending some guards down there. Well, what if I'm wrong? Father would look stupid. That's what I'm saying, Glim. I need to know for sure. I must find some sort of proof. I've been following him. You've what? He gaped his mouth in incredulity. He looks human, Glim, but he comes and goes out of the canal like an Argonian. That's how I noticed him. When I looked where he came out, I'm sure the first few steps were made by a crocodile, and after that by a man. Glim closed his mouth and shook his head. Our man stepped in some crocodile tracks, he said. There are potions and amulets that let you gaspers breathe underwater. But he does it all the time. Why would he do that? Help me be sure, Glim. Her friend sibilated a long hiss. Then can we drink your father's wine? If he hasn't drunk it all. Fine. She clapped her hands in delight. Excellent. I know his routine. He won't be back in his lair until nightfall, so we should go now. Lair? Sure. That's what it would be, wouldn't it? A lair. Fine. A lair. Lead on. And now here we are, Aniag thought. They had made their way from the hills of the old imperial quarter to the ancient, gangrenous heart of Lilmuth, Posbottom. Imperials had dwelt here too, in the early days when the Empire had first imposed its will and architecture on the lizard people of Blackmarsh. Now only the desperate and sinister dwelt here, where patrols rarely came, the poorest of the poor, political enemies of the Argonian and Zael party that now dominated the city, criminals and monsters. They found the lair easily enough, which turned out to be a livable corner of a manse so ancient the first floor was entirely silted up. What remained was vastly cavernous and rickety, and not that unusual in this part of town. What was odd was that it wasn't full of squatters. There was just the one. He had furnished the place with mostly junk, but there were a few nice chairs and a decent bed. That's about all they got to see before they heard the voices, coming in the same way they had, which was to say the only way. Aniag and Glim were backed up in the corner, and here the walls were stone. The only way to go was up an old staircase, and then even farther, using the ancient frame of the house as a ladder. Aniag wondered what sort of wood, if wood it was, could resist decomposition for so long. The wall and floorboards here had been made of something else and were almost like paper, so they had to take care to stay on the beams. Glim hushed himself. The figures in the group below were gazing up, not at them, but in their vague direction. Aniak took a small vial from the left pocket of her double-breasted jacket and drank its contents. It tasted a bit like melon, but very bitter. She felt her lungs fill and empty, the elastic pull of her body around her bones. Her heart seemed to be vibrating instead of beating, and the oddest thing was she couldn't tell if this was fear. The faint noises below suddenly became much louder, as if she was standing among them. "Where is he?" one of the figures asked. They were hard to make out in the dim light, but this one looked darker than the rest, possibly a Dunmer. "He'll be here," another said. He, or maybe she, was obviously a Khajiit. Everything about the way he moved was feline. "He will," the third voice said. Aniag watched the man she had been following for the last few days approach the others. Like them, he was too far away to see, but she knew him by the hump of his back, and her memory filled in the details of his brutish face and long unkempt hair. "Do you have it?" the Khajiit asked. "Just brought it in, under the river." "Seems like a lot of trouble," the Khajiit said. "I've always wondered why you don't use an Argonian for that." "I don't trust them. Besides, they have ripper eels trained to hunt Argonians trying to cross the outer canal. They're not so good at spotting me, especially if I rub myself with eel slime first." "Disgusting. You can keep your end of the job, just as long as I get paid for it." He pulled off his shirt and removed his hump. "Have a look. Have a taste if you want." "Oh, Daedra divines," Aniag swore from the beam they crouched on. "He's not a werecrock. He's a skooma smuggler." "You're finally going to kill me," Glim said. "Not so much kill you as get you killed. It works out the same." And now Aniag was quite sure that what she felt was fear. Bright, terrible, animal fear. "By the way," the Khajiit below said, lowering his voice, "who are those two in the rafters?" The man looked up. "Sooth. If I know," he said, "none of mine." "I hope not. I sent Patch and Flitch up to kill them." "Oh, Koak," Aniag hissed. "Come on, Glim." As she stood, something wisped through the air near her, and a shriek tore out of her throat. "I knew it," Glim snapped. "Just come on, we have to get to the roof." They ran across the beams, and someone behind her shouted. She could hear their footfalls now. Why hadn't she before? An enchantment of some sort. "There," Glim said. She saw it. Part of the roof had caved in and was resting on the rafters, forming a ramp. They scrambled up it. Something hot and wet was trying to pull out of her chest, and she hysterically wondered if an arrow hadn't hit her, if she wasn't bleeding inside. But they made it to the roof, in a 50-foot fall. She pulled out 2 vials and handed one to Mer Glim. "Drink this and jump," she said. "What? What is it?" I'm not sure. It's supposed to make us fly." "Supposed to? Where'd you get it? Why is that important?" "Oh, the towel. You made it, didn't you? Without a formula. Remember that stuff that was supposed to make me invisible? It made you sort of invisible. It made my skin translucent. Looked like a big band of offal. walking around. She drank hers. No time, Glim, it's our only hope. Their pursuers were coming up the ramp, so she jumped, wondering if she could flap her arms, or the what if she did was fall and shriek. But then she wasn't falling so fast, and then she was sort of drifting, so the wind actually pushed her like a soap bottle. She heard the men hollering from the roof and turned to see Glim floating just behind her. See, she said, you need to have a little faith in me. She barely got the sentence out before they were falling again. Later, battered, sore, and stinking of the trash pile that broke their final fall, they returned to her father's villa. They found him passed out in the same chair Aniag had been in earlier that morning. She stood looking at him for a moment, at his pale fingers clutched on a wine bottle, at his thinning grey hair. She was trying to remember the man he had been before her mother died, before an Anzailil wrested Lilmuth from the Empire and looted their estates. She couldn't see him. Come on, she told Glim. They took 3 bottles of wine from the cellar and wound their way up the spiral stair to the upper balcony. She lit a small paper lantern, and in its light poured full 2 delicate crystal goblets. To us, she said. They drank. Old Imperial Lilmuth spread below them, crumbling hulks of villas festooned with vines and grounds overgrown with sleeping palms and bamboo. All dark now, as if cut from black velvet, except where illumined by the pale phosphorousness of Lucan mold, or the wispy yellow airborne shines, harmless cousins of the Delhi willow wasps and the dead swamps. There now, she said, rifling her glass. Don't you feel more alive? He blinked his eyes very slowly. Well, I certainly feel more aware of the contrast between life and death, he replied. That's a start, she said. A small moment passed. We were lucky, Glim said. I know, she replied, but what? Well, it's nowhere, Croc, but we can at least report the skoomer dealers to the underwarden. They'll have moved by then, and even if they catch them, there's a drop of water in the ocean. There's no stopping the skoomer trade. There certainly isn't, if no one tries, she replied. No offense, Glim, but I wish we were still in the Empire. No doubt. Then your father would still be a wealthy man, not a poorly paid advisor to the Anzailil. It's not that, she said. There was justice under the Empire. There was honor. You weren't even born. Yes, but I can read, Mayor Glim. But who wrote those books? Bretons? Imperials? And that's an Anzailil propaganda. The Empire is rebuilding itself. Titus Mede started it, and now his son Atribus is at his side. They're bringing order back to the world, and we're just dreaming ourselves away here, waiting for things to get better by themselves. The Argonian gave his imitation shrug. There were worse places than Lilmuth. There are better places too. Places we could go, places where we could make a difference. Is this your Imperial City speech again? I like it here. It's my home. We've known each other since we were hatchlings, yes, and if you didn't already know you could talk me into almost anything, you do know. But leaving Black Marsh, you won't get me to do. Don't even try. Don't you want more out of life, Glim? Food, drink, good times. Why should anyone want more than that? It's people wanting to make a difference, causing all the troubles in the world. People who think they know what's better for everyone else. People who believe they know what other people need. never bother to ask. That's what your Titus Mead is spreading around, his version of how things ought to be, right? There is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil. If you say so. Prince Atropus rescued an entire colony of your people from slavery. How do you think they feel about the Empire? My people knew slavery under the old Empire. We knew it pretty well. Yes, but that was ending when the Oblivia Crisis happened. Look, even if you have to admit that if Mehrunes Dagon had won, if Martin hadn't beaten him, Martin and the Empire didn't beat him in Blackmarsh, Glim said, his voice rising. The Anzilio did. When the gates opened, Argonians poured into oblivion with such fury and might, Dagon's lieutenants had to close them. Eniag realized that she was leaning away from her friend, and that her pulse had picked up. She smelled something sharp and faintly sulphurous. Amazed, she regarded him for a moment. Yes, she finally said, when the scent diminished. But without Martin's sacrifice, Dagon would have eventually taken Blackmarsh too, and made this world his sports ground. Glim shifted and held out his glass to be refilled. I don't want to argue about this, he said, and see that it's important. You sounded as if you thought so for a second there, old friend. I thought I heard a little passion in your voice, and you smelled like you were spoiling for a fight. It's just the wine, he muttered, waving it off. And all of the excitement for the rest of the night, can we just celebrate that your flying potion wasn't a complete failure? She was starting to feel warm in her belly, the wine and its business. Well, yes, she said. I suppose that's worth a toast or two. They drank those, and then Glim looked a little sidewise at her. Anyway, he began, then stopped. What? He grinned his lizard grin and shook his head. You may not have to go looking for trouble. From what I heard, it might be coming for us. What's this? The Wind Oracle put into port today. Your cousin is Tanasha's boat. Yeah. Says he saw something out on the deep, something coming this way. Something? That's the crazy part. He said it looked like an island with a city on it. An uncharted island? An unmoored island, floating in the air, flying. Aniak frowned, set her glass down and wagged a finger at him. It's not funny, Glim. You're teasing me. No, I wasn't going to tell you, but the wine. She sat up straighter in her chair. You're serious? Coming this way? Swat, he said. Huh, she replied, taking up the wine again and sinking back into her chair. I'll have to think about that. Flying city. Sounds like something left over from the Merethic era, or before. She felt her ample mouth pulling a huge smile. Exciting. I'd better go see Hekua tomorrow. And so they finished that bottle and opened another, an expensive one. And outside the rains came, as they always did, a moving curtain glittering in the lamplight, clean and wet, washing away for the moment, alone with scent of mildew and decay. And that is where we will leave off